Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Fram Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Professor Edward Fram, who is Associate Professor of Jewish History and holds the Sali Yellen Chair in Lithuanian and Eastern European Jewry at Ben Gurion University of the Negev. And we'll be discussing his book that he edited/published a number of years ago called A Window on Their Worlds, The Court Diaries of Rav Chayim Gundersheim of Frankfurt am Main, 1773 to 1794. And we'll be discussing this book and this topic. So thank you, Professor Fram, for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me.
So let's start off, tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
So I teach Jewish history at Ben Gurion University, as you mentioned, and I studied at Yeshiva College in New York, where I studied both Jewish history or Jewish studies and in the Yeshiva program. And later I studied also at Bernard Revel Graduate School. And there were some periods of intermittent study in yeshivot in Israel. And then later I went on to Columbia University, where I did my doctorate.
So, I mean, we could go ahead and you've published a number of other books, but I think with this one, I mean, how did you get to this diary, and why did you decide to publish a court diary? And maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. Maybe I should back up. What is let's leave that question. What is a court diary? What does that mean?
So a court diary is essentially one of the members of the rabbinic court in Frankfurt kept a record of the cases that he heard. So this is a personal diary. It's not the same as a professional stenographer who would sit in court today and record everything. Not every word that was said before the court is recorded, but rather the judge decided what was important to him to record for his own personal records. And he wasn't alone. Other judges on the court also kept personal records, and sometimes they shared these records with each other. So they had an idea of who the litigants were, when the case took place, obviously, what the major claims of each side were. We don't know if these were all the claims or not. We just know that these were the major claims, and ultimately what the decision was.
Now, and then, like you said, this is just more of a personal recollection rather than the official court records, right?
That's right. And so much so that at the very end, he lists the members of the court who sat with him on the tribunal, usually a tribunal. Sometimes there could be more. They would have expanded court. But if there were other members sitting there, he would list the other members of the court, and then he would sign finally the ani and me. So it really is a personal record.
Interesting. Now, we'll get to the author and more in a second, but the question I asked before, they really jumped the gun. I mean, why did you decide? Why publish a court diary? Why work on this? And I should mention right away, you have a introduction, pretty lengthy introduction explaining things, and then you have the actual diary with the Hebrew text with the English translation to it. So it's a large book. Why decide to do that?
So essentially, sometimes one goes searching a project, and sometimes the project searches one out. In this case, the manuscript is held in the Jewish Museum in Frankfurt, and they realized they had a manuscript of some interest, and they came to me and they asked me if I would be interested in working on this manuscript. And truth to tell, I had no familiarity with a court diary before, but it's a type of legal source, a Jewish legal source, that we don't have any real records of. Nobody had published anything like this before. So I thought that this was an opportunity to look at something new, to try to discover some new possibilities for looking at Jewish history and also the application of Jewish law in early modern society. So I wish I could claim credit saying, wow, I searched and I found this out, but I didn't. Somebody called me from the museum and said, will you work on this?
And something else I was going to ask a little later, but I'll ask it here. It's relevant to what you just said is, the kind of the legal things that we have, besides for halachic writings, and on Shulchan Aruch and Torah and whatever, we also have shalos v'tshuvos. We have the responsa literature, which is the most common. And you discussed this in the introduction, how this court diary differs from that. It's not the same. So maybe talk a little bit, I guess, here already, how a court diary differs from a standard shalos v'tshuvos that we would have.
So generally in shalot v'tshuvot, you have somebody who asks the question of a rabbi. And in most cases, not all cases, but most cases in the early modern period, rabbis didn't take questions from just anybody. They would take from other rabbis or from rabbinic courts. They weren't there for anyone to just turn to as they pleased. And they would answer those questions. Of course, they'd answer those questions based on the information that was supplied to them. We also don't really have a good sense of whether those answers that they provided were really accepted, because we have no follow-through. Maybe in a few cases we have something that's mentioned, but most often we don't. We often also in Sheilot Teshuvot were dependent upon, or just as the rabbi who answered the question was dependent upon the information that was supplied to him. A court diary is somewhat different. First of all, the court doesn't choose the cases that come before it. And people of different status come before it. We have cases here of the wealthiest people in the Jewish community in Frankfurt and the poorest of the poor. We have servants who come before the court. So we have a whole plethora and a whole range, a broad range of people who come before the court and ask their questions. And these questions are very, very different. We have disputes over things that wouldn't necessarily go to a rabbi, at least not a posek, and here are brought before the court. So the court gives us a much broader sense of day-to-day life within a Jewish community, and not necessarily the great questions of the time.
And perhaps we'll get into some examples like what you mentioned throughout. So I think at this point we should discuss, the author of the diary, like we mentioned, is someone, Rav Chayim Gundersheim. I hadn't heard of him. I'm sure many haven't heard of him. So I think give a little bit of biography and a background of his life and who he was.
So Chayim Gundersheim, like almost all members of the rabbinic court in Frankfurt, except the Av Beit Din, except the head of the tribunal, was a local boy, so to speak. He was born in Frankfurt. His father had immigrated to Frankfurt, but he was born in Frankfurt and grew up in Frankfurt, studied there. And due to his success in his studies, he eventually became a member of the court. But this was very common, that local people made up the bulk of the rabbinic court. The head of the court, in this case, Pinchas Horowitz, Baal HaFla, was certainly a leading rabbinic authority of the 18th century. He was not a native of Frankfurt, but he was the head of the community. He was the rabbi of the community and the head of the court. But the other members of the court were all locals. And Chayim Gundersheim was such a local. He gave an ongoing shiur in the community in Gemara. They seemed to try to work their way through the entire Talmud. This was not Daf Yomi, but a precursor. And it was every day they would learn. And he also, like many other people, taught in the local yeshiva. So his day was somewhat divided between theoretical learning and practical learning of being on the court.
Now, when did he become a judge? How did that happen that he got onto the court?
So they had elections and people were appointed, and the Jewish community records that we have, the Pinkas, they list that this year we will have A, B, and C as being rabbis of the court. And usually there were 6 to 9 rabbis, and they served in a rotation, often for 6 months at a time, and then somebody else would rotate in. And of course, if they were related to anyone in any given case, because they were locals, that could very often happen. So then somebody else would move in their place for that particular case. And these appointments would be done every few years. People would be appointed. But Gundersheim was, for a good part of his life, a member of the rabbinic court in Frankfurt. And he sat there together with some other very important rabbis. Meir Schiff was an important rabbi who was there. Natan Mas was another one. These people who authored works either on Talmud or in Halacha, people who are known. This was a court of some standing.
Yeah, I'll mention Rav Natan Mas, like you said, he I think is known as the Talmud of the Pnei Yeshua. We do have for him Sefer Binyan Shleima. There's published by the Zara and Sanhedrin is published, maybe another one, and then there recently was published a manuscript. I know there's a lot of manuscripts of his, and I think there was a number that about 10, 15 years ago, there was a new couple editions published. So he's one that the listeners may know of. And you mentioned
Meir Schiff, of course, is somebody also they would be familiar with. And also his brother, of course, became the head of the Jewish community in London. So these people were certainly known. These were not rabbis who one would consider to be minor figures in terms of the late 18th century.
Meir Schiff being the Maram Schiff.
Yes, but not necessarily the Maram Schiff in the back of the Gemara, but rather had written another Perush on the Talmud. But again, someone who people would know, and he had Shuvas as well. He himself authored responses. So again, leading people.
Right, just Yeah, just clarify, it wasn't that one. Okay, and like you already mentioned, Pinchas Horowitz, who I think is probably the most well known of any here, the Haflah, the Makne, the Panam Yafis. I mean, he was quite a famous figure. So that's another one that should be mentioned.
But remember, though, sorry, just to barge in, but someone like Horowitz would come from a different cultural background. Horowitz came from the East, whereas all these people were locals. They'd be familiar with local Frankfurt customs. They'd be familiar with ways of doing business in Frankfurt. These are things that Horowitz wouldn't have known, so much so that Horowitz never really mastered German, whereas these other individuals were able to speak. Chaim Gundersheim's father actually met the emperor twice in Frankfurt. So he clearly was able to communicate well in German.
Do we ever see in here, does it ever come, I mean, the Chassam Sofer, right? Moshe Sofer was at this time, and so is Nathan Adler, I think. Do they ever come up in here, or they do no
They regard? Do. Nathan Adler, of course, was a problematic person. He was very strong in his own beliefs, and he had his own little shul that people didn't like. He was not allowed to keep them. Ultimately, he was put in cherem. He was excommunicated. And the excommunication was only removed just shortly before his death, so he could be buried in the Jewish cemetery without any sort of hassle. But yes, Nathan Adler is someone who we are familiar with. And of course, the Chassam Sofer was a student of Adler's at this time.
Right. I mean, to be clear, you mean that was problematic. I mean, from that whole, that which goes on in here with the shul and all the other stories that happen.
That's right. I'm not speaking to his own personality, but he wanted to maintain his own way of praying in his own private synagogue, and the community was against that because they were against private synagogues. Private synagogues essentially lowered the value of seats in the main synagogue. In those days, seats were a piece of real estate. And if you have other places to pray, then you don't have to pray in the main synagogue and prices go down.
And once we're there, we can take this way, what you just mentioned. There are a lot of bickering. There's a lot of fighting over seats going on. And today, I mean, I'm sure many people go into shul, they want their seat, they want their end seat or whatever it is. But I don't think they're going to front of a bezdin about their seat and fighting over their seat in shul. I mean, maybe just talk a little bit just in general, not only like how seats in shul worked and why it was so important. You had this one's widow coming and this one's kid coming. I want my father's seat, and what was going on that there's so much, so many cases over seats in shul.
Right. Well, nowadays, you very often, I don't know what the case is everywhere in the United States, but probably most of us remember there was a time that people's names were on the seats, right? Now, people's names on the seats harkens back to a time when people owned the seats. In this community of Frankfurt, you owned your seat. Now, if you owned your seat, you could own half a seat, or you could own a quarter of a seat. In some cases, you could own an eighth of a seat. And not only do you own seats in the men's section, people own seats in the women's section. And some seats were better than others. There are people who complain that their seat's blocked by a pole. They can't see everything. That seat's not worth, like going to the opera, right? If you can't see it, you get a cheaper seat. So people argued over these seats, who had the seats and who had the right to sit in the seats. How are you supposed to divide a quarter seat? Who got to sit in it? But on the other hand, these seats had value. People sold the seats. They passed them on as inheritances. And that's what brought about the disputes within the court. When these seats either had to be liquidated, divided, or anything else, the court often became the point where these things were settled.
I think that's something so fascinating. Like the book title says, A Window on Their World, is something that today we're like, oh, seat and shul, like you're saying. But back then, this was a really important, that was a real important part of everyday life versus to something like today. So something else, getting back to the judges, I mean, I don't think we mentioned was, so being a dayan, being a judge, was that a full-time position? And was it a paid position? I mean, was it something that they did on the side? It was like an honorary, it was just an honor to be one.
Well, it was an honor to be one. There's no question, but you also got paid for it. But it was not a full-time position. You'd get a certain percentage of the value of the case. Or in other cases, you would just be paid, certainly on cases that were not dealing with thousands and thousands of Reichstaler, so then you would just receive a certain amount for the case. Yes, judges were paid for this. You could not live off the salary of being a rabbinic judge. The only person who received a full-time salary would be the head of the community. That would be Pinchas Horovitz, as the Av Beit Din, the head of the rabbinic court. He received a full-time salary. And when he first came to Frankfurt, he actually complained that it wasn't enough. The salary they were giving him, he couldn't live off, and they had to raise his salary. But be that as it may, the other people had other jobs. So someone like Gundersheim would be teaching in a klois, in a rabbinic study hall, or something similar. Some people on the court were members of klois. Other people were just in some sort of Beit Midrash of some sort.
Another function of the courts is the representatives, a dayan, right? So how would that, each case, so it wasn't just always that each litigant came to the case, they would actually have a representative. How did that process work?
So there were people beyond the cases of the judges who lived in Frankfurt. There were also learned people who were also there. These people who studied in the local study halls, they became learned as well. And some of them took it upon themselves to also represent people before the court. Now, again, I can't say that these people were full-time, what we would call today lawyers, but they certainly got paid for this. And there were a number of such people in the community. Other people there could also act as notaries for the community. There were recognized notaries that the Frankfurt community recognized. And so that was not, they may have all had this job as well. But on the whole, there were people who used their rabbinic learning, not just for teaching, but in the practical case of helping others within the court.
Another thing relating to the court was, you mentioned earlier differently, Shalos Tshuvos, we don't know the outcome. So here, we don't necessarily know the outcome either. The court would issue a ruling. How did they know that first of all, how did they know that it would, be enforced? And also they could go to non-Jewish courts and just suddenly take it out of the court system, and then it wouldn't be listened to. So how did they make sure that these rulings were enforced?
So it depends. For example, we have discussions here of chalitza. When a woman is married to a man and they have no children, and the man who has brothers dies. So before she can remarry, she has to go through a ceremony of chalitza, or levirate marriage in English, and that would be something that would be handled by the court. And here very often it says, we went and it was done on this day or that day. Or we have cases here where there was a compromise that was reached by the court, and the court often wanted to come to a compromise. And then they say, we met together with the litigants, they signed the compromise, they did this, and so we know that something took place. We don't know in every case that something was indeed carried out. But you're 100% correct. There were many people who did not like the rulings of the court, and they took them and appealed to the municipal court in Frankfurt. And there are cases that they go beyond. They simply go beyond the Jewish community. And there are all sorts of reasons for going beyond. But the most common one is, of course, that I didn't like the original decision, so I'm going to go somewhere else. There's not a real higher rabbinic court than Frankfurt. So where do you go? You go to the municipal court of Frankfurt, and Jews did.
Something else interesting that I forgot, I don't remember if we discussed, was the jurisdiction of the Frankfurt court. Was it limited locally to Frankfurt, or sometimes they would receive questions from elsewhere?
So the Frankfurt court was thought to be of such standing that Jewish communities beyond the borders of Frankfurt would turn to it for its decisions. And not only did the rabbinic courts turn to the Frankfurt court, but we have a number of cases that are in Gundersheim's diary in which the Imperial Aulic Court, or what would be the equivalent today in the United States of the Supreme Court of the Holy Roman Empire, turned to the Rabbinic Court of Frankfurt and asked them, can you please inform us about the rules of Jewish law? So there were cases that came from other Jewish communities, and there were even cases that came from non-Jewish courts who essentially did not ask the Rabbinic Court in Frankfurt to give a decision, but rather inform them about Jewish law.
And I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, the famous or infamous get of Clevis, a story took place a little before this diary went into effect, right? And that was with the Frankfurt court. Do we hear anything about that in here, or no?
No, there's nothing here. There are no ramifications of get of Cleves, but you are right that it did include Frankfurt at some point, and it had ramifications for the appointment of the next rabbi of Frankfurt afterwards, but that's before the period of this diary.
Okay, just wanted to confirm that. I mean, so perhaps, I mean, are there any? I think before that, so each entry, I mean, like I said, there's many. It's quite a large book. Each entry contains what? When the Rabbi Gundersheim writes in each specific entry, you want to explain what each one says?
So in almost every entry, there are some exceptions, but in almost every entry, he writes the date that the litigants came before, who the two sides were, and who represented them. He also records what their major claims were. Now, when I say what their major claims are, there may be claims that Gundersheim decided, this is just really irrelevant. I'm not even going to record this. That's such a silly claim, or it's totally not germane to the case. So we don't know what he excluded. We only know what he included. And he writes the major claims of each side. And then he says that we, the court, discuss this. And often he'll say that we, the court, ask them to agree that they would, and this we come back to enforcement, that they would accept our ruling. And if they did not, they would have to pay a fine both to the Jewish community of Frankfurt and to the municipality of Frankfurt. And then they said they would either give a ruling based on law or a ruling based on compromise. And then he says specifically what the ruling was. And he says who the judge is sitting on the court, and then the date. Those are the standard things that are in these records.
Do you have any specific interesting examples, or just of cases either in whole or just in part that you want to mention?
So there are a number of cases that I particularly like, but one is a very, very sad case. One of the servants, a maidservant who worked in Frankfurt, died. And she had an estate, a very modest estate. And her husband comes, who's impoverished, and he begs the court to try to take some liberties with giving out money from the estate to help support their children, the surviving children. So this is a case where we see really the poorest people come before the court. Now, a poor person wouldn't necessarily have representation, but the court was still willing to listen to his case and still accepted his case and dealt with his case and tried to deal as fairly as possible with the case. So that's one type that I find interesting for that reason. We have different cases about the division of property. How are you going to divide a house? The houses in Frankfurt were multi-floors. Jews were very limited in their residency in Frankfurt. You couldn't just live wherever you wanted. You had to live in the Jewish lane, or in German, Judengasse. You had to live in the Jewish lane. So needless to say, with very limited space and growing population, the only way to go was up. But you couldn't go too far up. But nonetheless, so you built your house, 3-4 stories. Right? There's no elevator, so you don't want it too high. And people don't get younger as they grow older. So you need a place. What are you going to do? How are you going to have this house? Well, it's nice to have a house. If you're a rich person, you can have a house all to yourself. But if you're not a rich person, or you're less wealthy, you would divide a house. And some of us may remember that once upon a time, there were houses, even at least that I remember, that my grandparents shared a house with somebody. And they had the downstairs and the other person had the upstairs. The entrance was the same. They shared the entrance and you walked in and they went upstairs. Even the telephone line was shared. So these things were things that were very common in this time. You shared the house. Well, how are you going to share a house? Nobody wants to be upstairs. You'd rather be downstairs. That's where you don't have to schlep the groceries up every time. So they came to the court to decide how they would divide the house. And the general rule of thumb was that people in the house, the families in the house, would rotate living quarters every 3 years. So if you were downstairs, you would have downstairs for 3 years. And then after 3 years, you'd go upstairs and the family upstairs would come downstairs. And that was thought to be the most equitable way to share the house. So these disputes are interesting. You can imagine decorating your house that if every 3 years, some of you are going to have to move out. They didn't do too much of that. But how did you share the kitchen? How did you share the space, the so-called public space in the house? So these are very interesting. But I think what I find most interesting in these cases are actually cases that came from outside of Frankfurt when non-Jewish authorities came to the court of Frankfurt and said, can you help us decide this case? And I think that shows a lot about the interworkings of Jewish-Christian relations in this time. These two communities may not always have loved each other, and they may not always have gotten along perfectly, but there was some sort of daily way of doing life, and non-Jewish authorities respected the right of Jews to be judged according to Jewish law. And to that end, they turned to the court in Frankfurt.
Interesting. And like I said, there are many other cases and subjects in the book as well.
Right. You even have directions on how to build a hospice. Why do you need directions? Why do you need to go to rabbinic court? The hospice was unfortunately, right next to the cemetery. Right? The assumption was that if you came to the hospice, you may not leave the hospice alive. And there would be dead people in the hospice. And the problem was one of ritual impurity. You didn't want that ritual impurity to spread throughout the entire Jewish land. And not only in Frankfurt, but we have also from other places in northern Italy, that they spent a lot of time thinking about how to build these buildings to make sure that the impurity would not escape the one building and spread throughout the town, which of course would be problematic for the priests, the Kohanim, who lived in the town of Frankfurt.
Right. Fascinating. So, okay, one last thing I think about the overall work, I think that I forgot to ask you earlier. There's a bit of an actually pretty interesting story about the actual manuscript that you mentioned is housed in Frankfurt. You describe this in some length in the beginning of the introduction. I actually think it's a pretty interesting kind of a story. I think the listeners might appreciate. So maybe you want to. I don't know if anything's been updated since this was published about 8-9 years ago. But maybe you want to talk a little bit about that.
So what happened was the manuscript, which may not be Rabbi Gundersheim's original hand. There are a number of hands in the manuscript. Some people copied. Perhaps some are his, perhaps some are colleagues. Not exactly clear who had what. But the manuscript was eventually found its way to the land of Israel. In the late 19th century, early 20th century, this manuscript was in Israel. And there was a major collector of manuscripts, Elkan Adler, who lived in London. And he was here in Israel, and he purchased the manuscript. I don't know if he purchased it himself or an agent purchased it for him, but it found its way to his collection. And it was in the Adler collection. In the 1920s, Elkan Adler had some financial difficulties due to a business partner, not his doing, but the partner. And Adler wanted to help him out. And in order to raise funds, he decided that he was going to sell his manuscript in rare book collection. And the Jewish Theological Seminary of America in New York was the purchaser. And almost all of the manuscripts and books found their way to New York, except for this one. This one, Adler had lent to somebody, a scholar named Charles Dushinsky, who was working in London at this time, and he had asked him, Adler, to borrow the manuscript. Now you say that may be strange. Who would lend out a manuscript? Well, I once used a manuscript in the town of Parma. And in those towns, in those libraries, you have to sign who uses the manuscript. This manuscript was from the 16th century. And it was signed by someone who took the manuscript to Marburg for 6 months to work on it and then returned it. Who was the person who signed? Her name was no less than Nechama Leibowitz. Nechama Leibowitz borrowed this manuscript and she worked her doctoral dissertation as based upon it. But she had taken it home with her. So it's not surprising that in the 1920s, Adler lent this to a friend. When the manuscripts were shipped to New York, Dushinsky still had the manuscript. Not out of malice, he was still working on it. He even wrote to Alexander Marx saying, I need the manuscript, I need to work on it, I'll send it to you. So the manuscript remained in England, and there was some correspondence between Mark and Dushinsky over the manuscript, but the manuscript seems never to have found its way to New York. Dushinsky died, and then the manuscript was sort of lost until the 1980s. In the 1980s, a Frankfurt dealer purchased the manuscript in England and brought it back to Frankfurt, where he gave it to the city of Frankfurt. And the city of Frankfurt transferred it to the Jewish Museum in Frankfurt. And that's where it remains to this day. I am told that the Jewish Theological Seminary is sort of given up on trying to get it back. And so it still remains in Frankfurt.
Fascinating. It's still an interesting story nonetheless, and you discuss this in the introduction. I think I will mention also that the book, so interestingly, it's a little bit larger than your standard size book, which is nice. It's hardcover, and it's about over 600 pages. So it's a large book with introduction, and it's a Hebrew English, like I said, and then it has in the back, there's appendices and index.
Well, I don't want to mislead any readers. The cases are not translated, they're summarized. In other words, you're given the entire transcription of the case in the original, which is usually Hebrew, sometimes Yiddish or Judeo-German, but generally Hebrew. And then there's a summary of each case that tells what's involved and what the decision is and the like. Right.
That's good to clarify. Thank you. So that is in there as well. And that's really, it's available. I'll add the link to it. It should be available on Amazon for those new estimates. It's widely available, and it's pretty affordable. So it should be, which is good for books, academic books. I think the last question is that I would ask you is on your future projects. I know you've worked in the past on a couple of you have some other books, like I mentioned, but are there any? What are you working on now?
So I'll tell you what I've just completed and then what I'm working on as well, because what I'm working on is actually related to this. I've completed a study of the codification of Jewish law in the 16th century that I hope will be published by the end of 2022. And it focuses on the different methodologies of Rav Yosef Karo, Moshe Isserles, and Shlomo Luria in trying to come to some sort of code of Jewish law. And that was a multi-year project that I was working on, and that's, as I said, completed. And the project that I'm working on currently is in many ways an outgrowth of something that you mentioned before. When you have cases before the Jewish court in Frankfurt, and you don't like the outcome, or you're looking to find a different outcome, so they went to the municipality. But one case that I found together with a colleague, Professor Verena Kasper Marienberg, is a case that deals with Jews who took their case all the way to Vienna, that is to the Imperial Aulic Court, to the Supreme Court of the Empire. They're not alone. Jews from Frankfurt often went all the way to Vienna. But this case is interesting in particular because, as in some of the cases in the Gundersheim book, they provide the Supreme Court, the Holy Roman Empire, with the sources of Jewish law to judge their case. And this is interesting because it says essentially that it was accepted that Jews could be judged by non-Jews according to Jewish law, even though non-Jews knew nothing really about Jewish law. But Jews could supply them, and then they would be judged. So this is an interesting case, somewhat of an outgrowth of this book, but also a different look at how Jewish self-government works, Jewish legal autonomy works, and how Jews interact together with the non-Jewish society.
Very interesting. So thank you very much for joining me, Professor Fram. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me.